Wiradjuri land I could do welcome, but I am on another nation's land and I can't do welcome. Only they can do welcome. So here we go. I would like to acknowledge the Guringai and the Darkinjung Nation, the traditional custodians of this land where we meet upon today. Also pay my respects to elders both past and present, and honour all youth in Australia who are our future, and I can assure you it is safe in their hands. I would also like to welcome Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people here today. And also, on a personal note, I would like to acknowledge all the Labor team, young, and the Labor candidates, and especially Bill, Shorten, I should say. I call you Bill at home when I'm watching the telly. And I find Bill Shorten one of the most sincere, honest, genuine gentlemen that I know. I would also like to pay my respects to my union brothers and sisters. Ordinary people doing outstanding jobs for our nation. Our party was formed on the union movement, and I am proud of everyone here today, and I love you all. Welcome, welcome, welcome to Guringai and Darkinjung land. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land.
And great thanks, my friend, my guide, my mentor.
Yay,
I also acknowledge the wonderful land that we are meeting on today, Darkinjung and Guringai land. It's a great privilege for us to be here. I pay my respects to elders past and present and any Aboriginal people who are here with us today. And I particularly acknowledge the young leaders coming up through the ranks because you are our future. Aboriginal land always was, always will be. Now I have the great privilege of being here to welcome the next Prime Minister of Australia. Labor's candidate for the seat of Robertson. I love this community and I know it well. I've lived here, my kids have gone to school here, I've worked for and among you for many, many years. I understand the love and the pride that you have for this patch because I have it too. And my hard work is driven by a passion that nobody should be left behind. But unfortunately, in our society today, there are people who are being left behind, and I want to tell you about Elsie Green, because we left her behind. Elsie was a beautiful friend, neighbour, family member and person in our community, and we failed her. Just like we continue to fail so many locals by not being able to provide comprehensive palliative care to every person who needs it. In our community today, when carers are unable to cope at home or unable to access the appropriate support services, they must call an ambulance. It's my understanding that we are the largest region in New South Wales that doesn't have its own palliative care facility. The largest region in New South Wales. Now I've raised this with Bill, poor Bill. He's put up with me for 6 years. I've raised this lack of service provision with Bill, as I said, for 6 long years. For 6 long years I've been part of the Elsie's Retreat Committee, and I give my respect to the committee members that are here today. Elsie's Retreat is a vision of a beautiful place full of love and kindness with a dedicated interdisciplinary team that will meet the needs of the patient, the family and the carers and work together effectively. Bill knows that it's not fair for this community to be left behind. It's not okay for our loved ones and our carers to suffer because we have a current government who doesn't believe in service provision. If elected, a Shorten a $20 million palliative care facility on the grounds of challenges. We have high unemployment and assess the training and the jobs that they need. It's a disgrace that in just 6 years we have 1,300 fewer apprentices on the Central Coast than we had when Labor was last in government. 1,300 fewer young people with a purpose, 1,300 fewer potential small business owners. Like Jason I met recently. Jason's a glazier who was trained when Labor was last in government, and he was able to take advantage of all of the supports and the training that Labor affords. Jason doesn't have an apprentice in his team because he can no longer get anybody trained on the coast. They've shut the courses down. So if he had an apprentice, they'd have to travel to Newcastle or to Sydney to train. And he said that under the current government, with the cuts and the lack of support, it's just not viable for him to employ an apprentice. Or Katie, who's just finishing her apprenticeship, and she tells me that Gosford TAFE is like a ghost town. My biggest concern is what happens to the Jasons and the Katies of the future. We can do better. We must do better. But stripping funding from our essential services is not the answer. Education must be a priority for our community. And only a Labor government truly understands that every child deserves a quality, highest quality education, and that every young person must be able to access the training and the support they need at TAFE or at university or indeed in the community. I door knock this electorate every day, as many of you know, and shout out to those that have door knocked. Recently I spoke with a beautiful elderly woman, Shirley, who just lives up the road in Angler Street. Shirley told me about a terrible fall that she'd had, and this won't be a surprise to many of you who are locals. She was walking up from Angler Street to Rawson Road. The bitumen was cracked and uneven, as we all know, and Shirley spent 2 days in hospital with the most horrific bruising and cuts and on her face. She'd lost consciousness, they needed to call an ambulance. And she has completely lost confidence to leave the house and exercise, which she so dearly needs. Shirley's story, in addition to the hundreds of people who tell me about the potholes that wreck their wheels, the constant bumps from the uneven surface on their cars that wreck their suspension, and not to mention, local community, you will understand this, the number of people who get fined for parking on their own verge because we don't have roads where they can park on. I mean, this is just simply, there's nowhere else to park. The Liberals would suggest that these families should move to another area or buy a bigger car, but I don't think that's fair or reasonable, do you? No. This election is a battle between a government who is determined to undermine our Medicare, our education, our local services, our infrastructure and our jobs, versus a Shorten-led Labor Party who is listening, who has the people and the policies that will make a real difference for our community. We are so lucky to have Bill Shorten here today.
We are.
Bill's held events like this across the country, and this is our collective opportunity to speak to Bill. Bill, thank you so much for being here. I welcome you and I appreciate your time.
Hello everyone, and my goodness me, what a massive turnout. Thank you very much for saying we can do better in this country. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet. I acknowledge their elders, both past, present and emerging, and I want to thank Auntie Robin for one of the best acknowledgements to country we've had. You've been doing that. I'm going to keep my introduction brief because what I want to do is hear from you. This is not the first time that we've done these sort of meetings on the Central Coast, but with Emma McBride and with Anne Charlton, we are giving the Central Coast the best candidates on offer in this election. And it's great to have Assistant Shadow Minister Deb O'Neill here, no stranger to the
Yep,
Central
yep,
Coast. And one of the secret weapons of this election campaign, Senator Christina. Maybe not so secret. Anyway, what I want to do is to hear from you. Now, this has been an open invitation, so there's some of you who clearly quite pro-Labor, which is great. But we've invited the community. So this isn't one of these sort of Liberal functions where, you know, it's entrance only with a, you know, you select guest list. This is for the people. So I'm keen to hear your point of view. You know, I don't expect we're all going to agree on everything. Well, that'd be impossible. But what I'm interested to do is hear your point of view, your questions about our policies, your observations. If we cover off on an issue once or twice, perhaps then we can move on to other issues, because that way there's so many different and exciting things to talk about. Then what we'll do is perhaps invite 4 people at a time to, you know, give your view. Just give us your name so we're having a conversation. And then I'll do my very best to answer it, and of course I've got some very capable local knowledge sitting up at the front table too, so I'll ask for their assistance and observation on what you say. The reason why we do this, the reason why I am here, is because politics in this country has to change. You know, the overwhelming sentiment I got this summer when I took the family and we went on holiday down at the coast, Victoria though, where you need to swimming. You know, even lifetime Liberals would come up to me and they'd say, oh, I voted Liberal my whole life. I don't necessarily like every policy you got, but we're just sick of the instability and division. People are over it. And the instability and division of this current government, as they're on their 3rd Prime Minister, their 22nd reshuffle, their 13th energy policy, it goes to something deeper with the frustration with Australian people. What people tell me is that they want a vision for the future. They don't necessarily want to hear what I think of the other fellow, or indeed what the other fellow thinks of me. What people tell me wherever I go is, what are you going to do for us, the people of Australia? That's what we elect you to do, to look after us. Now, my team have put forward some very concrete policies. We've explained how we pay for our promises. We've explained what sort of country we want this place to be in 2030 and beyond. You know, sometimes a lot of the political commentary can overcomplicate politics. Politics, for me, is ultimately about your family and your health. If your family's okay, if your health's okay, then righto, everything else is pretty interesting. But if your family's in trouble, if your health's not great, then you realise everything else is a sort of an optional extra which you can't take for granted because you need to get the fundamentals right. So we make no apology for saying that we want to manage the economy in the interest of working people. The government, they love to say, who do you trust to do X or Y? Well, I say, who do you trust to manage the economy in the interest of middle and working class people? That to me is a fundamental test. Who do you trust to make sure that we can reverse the cuts to schools and hospitals? Who do you trust to make sure that we can take real action on climate change and encourage the use of more renewable energy and get those electricity and power prices down? Who do you trust to do something about the problem that everything's going up in Australia except your wages? Who do you trust to make sure that the pensioners get looked after? I mean, this is a government who thinks that when Labor wants to close down tax loopholes, they call that a tax increase. This is a government who's so used to looking after their mates that they've forgotten what a tax matter is. What I want to use our taxes to give you the best aged care possible, to give you the best schools possible, to give you the best apprenticeship system possible, to give you the best healthcare system possible. So now what I'd like to do is hand over to yourself. This is a very special part of Australia, but under the federal government, it has become, as someone said, the forgotten coast, not the Central Coast. I mean, not only, and it's big, and a big tick to Anne for her lobbying in terms of Elsie's retreat and palliative care, but today I can announce here, we haven't said this at a press conference before now, we will put up, because we've made the economic reform decisions, a $60 million package to work with local council to get the roads unclogged here. More for roads. So that's enough from me. As I said, anyone was welcome here. If you've got a point of view, make it. You know, if you just want to state your point of view and then politely ask at the end, do I agree with your point of view? That's a question. But we'll try and move through. If we can get through a dozen or 16 observations and questions, I and my talented Central Coast team, well then that'll be a good day. I hope after an hour you've got to know me a bit better, and I've certainly again got to reconnect with the Central Coast of New South Wales. Thank you very much for coming. We need our first questions.
First, yes, Brenda? Owana?
Stand up.
Hi. Hi, Mr. Shorten. My name's Owana. It's on. No, it's on. My name's Owana McBride from Elsie's Retreat, and I just wish to thank you, and Anne especially, for championing our cause, getting this 20 million to build a palliative care hospice that we so desperately need, is giving us the choice. What my question is, the ongoing funding. Now we have a Liberal state government to fund this wonderful place. We are going to need constant government help. So, yeah, I'm just wondering how this will...
And then Brenda?
Do I need the microphone? Hi, Mr. Shorten. My name is Brenda Booth. Look, I'm here because of stroke. I had a stroke when I was 41, and that was 18 years ago. And stroke is one of the biggest killers in Australia and the leading cause of adult disability in Australia. My question is around what is the Labor Party policy on a national telestroke service that will benefit all Australians, and also improving stroke services so that stroke survivors have better outcomes.
Thank you, Brenda.
I'm Shorten. I'm Nicole Motley. I'm current PNC Federation Councillor for the Central Coast and the President of our local high school PNC. My question is, I believe at the moment that federally there's funding for capital works for non-government and private schools, and I was wondering and hoping that Labor would support capital works funding for non-government public schools. As you're probably aware, a lot of our public schools their facilities are run down and tired. We've got teachers buying mats for our children to sit on. We've got kids that don't use the bathrooms because they're just a disgrace, and they'd rather hang on and get urinary tract infections and burst through the doors of an afternoon. So I was just wondering what your stance on that would be. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
My name's Richard Weller. My issue is climate change. I would like to ask our future PM to think seriously about climate, look at it as an emergency situation, declare an emergency if possible, and do everything that they can to cut emissions and prepare Australia for the serious impacts that are already occurring here.
Thank you.
This is another issue which isn't local, but I feel very, very strongly about. Scott Morrison said recently that Julian Assange should get no more help than any other Australian. And yet 2 Australian journalists were helped exceptionally. That's Peter Greste and James Ricketson. And they got out of prison. Even Julie Bishop actually went and spoke to his lawyers 2 years ago. Frank Kelly said on television that lots of people would like to get Assange home. I'm asking you, our Prime Minister to be, who will have this land in your lap if Julian gets a life sentence in America, would you go and speak to his lawyers and see what can be done to help this Australian get out of this terrible situation.
Thank you. Alana asked the point about the Commonwealth making a grant to be able to build the palliative care centre. We will sit down with the Government of New South Wales to secure ongoing funding. I'd be stunned if they said no, frankly. Palliative care close to the people you love in the community that you're most familiar with, to me seems to be a much better option than the current sort of charity which we have. So I'm confident that the New South Wales Government, and I'm confident if we get Anne Charlton here as our local member, she's very formidable, so I've got complete confidence we will secure this funding, and we put the New South Wales Government on notice now that it's the sensible and reasonable thing to do. And the good news for the New South Wales Government, if we form a government, is we're going to reverse the cuts to the New South Wales health system and hospitals. So they're going to have a little bit more money than otherwise. Brenda asked about greater support for stroke. Stroke is a massive killer. Both my parents in the end died of catastrophic heart attacks. Now there was plenty of circumstances why that happened, but it's a killer. And what we do know is that if you have a stroke, that the sooner you get that diagnosis and assistance, it just makes a life-saving difference in many cases. It wouldn't have been the case for my parents in particular, but I know that the earlier you can get that care, the quicker you can remedy the stroke. So we have already announced that we intend to roll out a telehealth service to link up 40 regional hospitals and emergency departments so that they can get that support when it is needed. So we do think stroke's a priority, and because I think that health is more important than tax loopholes, I can find the money to invest in telehealth to give regional hospitals better support in the diagnosis and treatment of stroke than have some of the biggest tax loophole systems in the world. It's just a matter of a choice or a priority. Your health is more important to me than tax rorts at the top end, full stop. So thank you. In terms of the question on school, first of all, if you're serving on the PNC, thank you. You know, the parents' councils, you know, they are thankless jobs. And of course, it doesn't matter what you get right. There'll always be a parent who says you haven't fixed this. You know, and it's sort of all of the responsibility, not much of the glamour of politics. So what we can do though to make your support easier, and I'll come to the Capital Works Fund in a moment, is that in Dobell, if we get elected, we're going to put back the money which the government originally promised when they ran for election in 2013 and then cut and never kept their words. The same in Robertson, the same across New South Wales. I jotted down a couple of the numbers for you. So you can tell people from here what's going on. But in Dobell, where Emma is, it's in the first 3 years, $20.7 million extra will go into the schools there. $18.8 million extra in Robertson, where we are in the schools here. They love that. In fact, right across New South Wales, in the first 3 years, it'll be $917 million, which should be there. Now, sometimes we hear in some of the conservative blogs or the free newspapers they give away at airports, they say, oh, what point is spending more money on education? You've heard that line. You'll see it perhaps if you're stuck somewhere and there's only one, you know, an after-dark TV channel. And what they'll say to you is, oh, well, more money doesn't help education. The only people who say more money invested in education doesn't help are people who don't need it. But the reality is that across our public schools and our less well-off Catholic and non-gov schools, we do need more resources. You tell a nation by its priorities, don't you? You know, you go down to the local, you go to a Westfield shopping centre. We've got marvellous shopping centres. They're big, they're enormous. You know, we've got amazing plasma TVs these days. So our kids, by looking at the adults in their lives, can work out we think plasma TV is important. We think shopping centres are important. But what message do we send our kids when they have inadequate facilities? When there's not enough teachers' aides to help the kids with the special learning needs? What message do we send our kids about how the adults in their world who they look up to, if they don't properly fund education? So we have in our party worked hard to reform the tax system because we want to look after the next generation. You know, this is something which, without knowing all of your backstories, I'm going to be so confident to say everyone in this room, regardless of your politics, we have one thing in common, at least. We want to hand on a better deal than the one we got.
True.
This is a fundamental philosophy which drives me every day, and that starts with education. So,
Yes.
man, did you know that the best educating countries in the world now provide universal 3-year-old kinder? That's, you know, 40 weeks a year, 15 hours a week. And of course the same with the 4-year-olds. It's been proven now that, you know, a child's brain, 90% of it will form by the age of 5. So if they learn how to be in groups, I'm not saying they've all got to learn, you know, languages or, you know, the violin, but the point about it is demonstrated that if you give your 3 and 4-year-olds that pre-learning experience with properly funded early childhood education system, we set the kids up for life. It makes an exponential difference in their learning in primary and secondary school. You mightn't be aware in Australia, we don't fund 3-year-olds. We don't fund it. And as of course, we're selling our kids short. And we have the money to be able to do it. It's just a decision about what we think is important. Of course, that also will help with the cost of living. Do you know how many couples there are? And I bet there's plenty of grandparents here who've got to do a fair bit of childcare. I want to say thank you to you, even if your own ones don't always thank you. But the point about it is it's expensive. So what I will give you if we get elected, what we will give you, my team and I, is that we will be with you when it comes to the cost of living. We'll be with you helping defray some of those costs. And we want to use scarce and important and precious taxpayer money to properly fund 3 and 4-year-olds. That's the best in the world. Yes. So therefore it's only just good enough for our kids, isn't it?
Yes.
On our government schools, we are making it very clear that we will put back the $14 billion over the next 10 years that this current government promised and has not delivered on. And that'll mean everything from, you know, more support in classrooms, the really bright kids who want to race ahead with their love of maths or their love of reading or writing, they'll get that support. But it also means that if your child's got a diagnosis of dyslexia, that should not be a deal killer in education. If your child has special needs, that doesn't mean that they should be treated as second class.
True.
Every Australian child, by their birthright, has the right to a quality education. So this is where this $14 billion will go. And on capital works, you know, with the great Tanya Plibersek, who will be an outstanding education minister. We have set aside money for some capital works because we get that that is very important. And always remember, it was a Labor government, Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard, Wayne Swan, who during the global financial crisis, which we didn't go into, the recession that most of the rest of the developed world went in, we had the building education revolution, which despite the critics had about a 1 and a 1.5% cost overrun. It's the single largest injection of new capital into our schools in Australia. When you go to vote on May the 18th, if you haven't pre-polled, when you go to vote on May the 18th, you'll probably be voting in a hall built by a Labor government when they were last in power, and we're going to keep it. Richard asked about climate change. Gee, this is an important issue. And if there was any issue which highlighted how broken this government is, it's climate change. I mean, if you wanted to vote for the other mob on climate change, then Malcolm Turnbull would still be Prime Minister. Voting for this current mob to see any change on climate change is truly the triumph of hope over experience. I don't want to spend too much talking about the other side, actually, because they haven't got a solution. They're on their 13th policy, and Just, it's unbelievable. Well, come to that, you're right. And what about the big picture first? And what we want to do if we get elected is move to 50% of our energy mix coming from renewables by 2030. We want to honour the Paris commitments, 45% carbon reduction. And we've got a range of ways to doing it. You know, I freely acknowledge that actually climate goes to a second issue, and I'll come back to specific climate. This country's got to learn to work together more. You can't see the current government pop up in this election without them having some sort of trash talking of Labor. But I reckon a lot of people are over that. If we form a government, we want to work with the other side, but what we won't do is have the lowest common denominator of inaction. But I'm more than happy to say that we didn't think it was the world's best solution, but the National Energy Guarantee, which Mr Turnbull came up with, we're going to use that framework with more ambitious goals to help reduce our industrial emissions, to help reduce emissions in our energy sector. And we want to work with the nation. I've already been sitting down with the big employers talking about how we can reduce their pollution without making them uncompetitive. We've been talking to the solar battery manufacturers. I want to have a solar battery manufacturing storage system in this country, making it. And to go to the latest lunacy of the current mob, yes, we will have electric vehicles in Australia. I guarantee you that in 2030, if you're still driving a petrol car, that's fine. Good luck to you. Mind you, you'll find it hard to buy a Toyota or a Hyundai car after 2025 which doesn't have an electric motor, but don't let that detail get in the way of the current government. Or if you like the government, if you want a good old horse and buggy, just knock yourself out. That's okay. This is a government eagerly awaiting the arrival of the 20th century, aren't they? You know. This is the mob who want you to throw away that colour TV, go back to black and white where images were simple. Don't listen to FM, that's dangerous and scary. For goodness sake, put away your phone and just get the old landline, the rotary dial. Truly, retro government with retro policies. But someone just yelled out about Adani, but let's talk about that before I get to Assange. We want those decisions, and any decisions, to be made with the best science, to be made according to the law. We're not into sovereign risk. But I have to say, the debacle of the last few days where you've got this beleaguered not health minister, well, he's beleaguered too, but the beleaguered environment minister, you know, they sort of don't, anyway, she's there. And she was making the decision. We got CSIRO, you know, the scientists all submitting reports. And then they get a bit of, you know, get those chain letters you get, you know, from annoying people from the LNP in Queensland. If you don't do this, you will lose your job. We will publicly humiliate you, which they then subsequently leaked, as you do. And so she made this decision under who knows what pressure. Tony Burke, our spokesperson, has asked the government, we want to see all the documentation now. Like, this is why we should have a National Anti-Corruption Commission. So we'll adhere to the law, we'll adhere to the best science, but I hope it's very clear to you that we've got to get beyond the climate change wars where this nation has basically been paralysed. I mean, the Australian people have got on with it. 2 million households now have solar. That was up from 7,000 in 2007. No doubt there was a government member there saying solar will never catch on. 2 million households. No, and we've got to look after the renters, and I'm happy to come to that in a moment. We need to take real action on climate because this government's letting down the future. It's missing out on the jobs, and it's actually not securing our energy system for the future. Climate will increasingly become a conservative option for power because once you've got the sweet spot of being the world's sunniest continent, the world's windiest continent, the world's best scientists, and of course we've got now storage systems from pumped hydro through to storage systems which will decrease in cost and improve in efficiency, then renewable energy will become a conservative option in this country and we're ready for it. Listen, I got asked about Assange. you were using the analogy of the journalist. I don't know if Assange is a journalist, but I'm not going to say to you that I think he's just like, you know, a backpacker who's been on a binge in Bangkok and needs the help of the embassy to, you know. I accept it is. It has more importance than that. Every Australian's entitled to consular assistance.
True.
But I'm happy to get my spokespeople to talk to his lawyers in the course of the next few weeks. I think that's a fair enough request. Okay.
Yay.
Yeah, so that I've got right up.
Hello, Bill.
He's up. There you go, and you're up.
My concern is a bit about China. Our investment in China.
There's a mic. What was your first name? It's on.
Okay, my name is David Nicholas. My issue is China, and noting that Chinese investment has declined in Australia precipitously in the last 2 years. What are we going to do? Where do you see us going with China in the next 4 years? Because they saved us in 2007 and 8 during the global financial crisis with your great management. Where are we going to go with them now? That's my question.
Okay, good.
Yeah, good morning, Mr. Shorten. Patrick Cox here. Congratulations on having the balls not to hide your itinerary, and congratulations to Deb O'Neill on the demolition job she did on Craig Kelly this morning on Gateway 2. My question actually concerns the NDIS. I am 72. I don't qualify for it because I'm over 65. I have been twice referred to my aged care, but apparently I don't qualify there because I have a son who is a full-time carer. At home, I'm mobile around the house with the aid of a walker, but because I don't rely on my son when I have a shower or have to go to the other little room, apparently I'm too healthy to qualify for anything. I get no help whatsoever. This wheelchair that I've got cost me $35 a week to hire, and when I get to whatever the price is, the sale price, it's mine then. But
Sure.
Until then, I get no help. What are your plans for that?
Okay, thank you very much.
Hi, my name's Trish. I'm actually a registered nurse on the Central Coast, but I've just been diagnosed with advanced breast cancer. And I've actually spent almost $10,000 in the last 5 weeks in out-of-pocket expenses. And I can't work either. Sorry, I'm probably going to start crying in a minute. And I just really wanted to thank you for the cancer plan. It may not be... Just grateful that it'll be there for other people that will be able to experience that and not have the pressure that I have and the financial burden that this is leaving to my family, and especially when I may not be alive in 5 years' time, for them to actually, I'm sorry, I'm going to start crying, but at least it'll be around for other people. So thank you very much for that.
I don't want to interrupt the flow of the questions, but you know, I've done 85 of these town hall meetings, public meetings, and there's always someone who just sort of makes you realise that there's stuff more important than the day-to-day rubbish that we do.
True.
You know, I'm talking about, you know, our day-to-day lives. You know, this is, Trish, you need to hear this, and I'm going to summarise the mood of the room. People love you. We only wish the best for you and your fight ahead. we get the other questions, I'll come back and go to the Tricia's policy point.
Hello, Pauline Wright is my name. I'm the President of the New South Wales Council for Civil Liberties and also a very proud Central Coast resident. And Trish, Bill is right. All of the love in this room is with you.
True.
But I wanted to talk about the issue of Indigenous justice in Australia. Will a Shorten Labor government reinstate a national legal aid service for our Indigenous people? I was appalled that the government has abolished that service, which is so important to people who have suffered from intergenerational disadvantage. They're 3% approximately of our population, yet represent about 25% of people in our jails. And they suffer hugely from all sorts of other legal crises in their lives. Debts, housing debts, all sorts of things that come up for them that don't come up for the rest of the population. They need a dedicated service that is culturally appropriate.
Michael, can you shout?
Well, I can shout.
Oh, we can get a microphone.
We're very glad to hear that you're endorsing the Royal Commission into Ageing and Disability, that there's a crisis occurring in both those fields that's foreseeable, that it's being caused by the current government's policies that we can do a lot about in Labor Party.
Yes.
That is that we need to provide basic access to basic services without a deep, long assessment process. The Home and Community Care Program, now called the Home Support Program, needs to be returned to a block funding model with simple access so that ordinary consumers can approach it and be guaranteed that they will be assessed immediately on the spot and provided with support. And it's the same in the disability field, where the NDIS is targeted to deal with the top 20, perhaps 25% of people with disabilities, and indeed there are still a lot of people missing out. We need another tier in both those areas of what I call primary care for disability and ageing.
Thank you.
My name's Cecily Briggs and I'm from Lyle. I trust you to be a really good economic manager.
Yeah.
Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg consistently push the line that the LNP has a mandate and a record of being the best economic managers, and that you and the Labor Party can't manage money. History and the economic facts record that Keating and, more importantly, Wayne Swan, during the GFC, set Australia up. Stopped the recession and then set Australia up to be a really good economy. How are you going to counteract the PM's misleading statements to convince the Australian people to vote for you? Should you do more? Should you actually basically call out his lies, his blatant lies, and is that enough?
We covered a range of issues there, but just to remind people, David asked about our relationship with China. What would a Labor government do to get it back on track? First of all, he said something which is fundamentally correct. Our economic growth, such as it is, has been fuelled by our domestic exports, by our exports from here to overseas, in particular to North Asia, our exports of energy, coal and iron ore. China has driven Australia's growth. Now, what we need to do is, in terms of our foreign policy of a Labor government, we've got the fabulous Penny Wong will be our foreign minister, is we intend to have a foreign policy with an Australian accent. And let me unpack what that means. America's still our close security ally, you know, and I was just reminded when I was up in Darwin not so long ago that in 1941, when Darwin was bombed, or beginning of 1942 I should say, 10 planes, we only had 10 planes in Darwin to defend it, 9 of them were shot down. All 10 of them were American planes. So, you know, with American domestic politics is sort of, yeah, it's interesting, it's interesting. So, but America's important to us, and they have been, and so I have respect for our relationship with America. But what we've got to do is not look at China through the worst case scenario of strategic threat. We've always got to maintain, you know, strong borders, and we've got to have a great defence force and all of that, and we'll do that. That's, you know, that goes without saying. But what we need to do is, I think, be more ambitious in our engagement with Asia. We call it our Future Asia strategy. We need to look at China not automatically as a threat. Doesn't mean we'll have to agree with everything their policies there, and there's decisions they make there that we simply don't agree with. They're different to our values. But having said that, we need to stop having a sort of little Australia mentality where the rest of the world is too frightening and too scary. We need to reach out and trade, we need to reach out in people-to-people relations, we need to get our universities reaching out. We've got to skip the current sort of short-term thinking that somehow the rest of the world in Asia is too difficult for us to deal with. So we'll keep advancing our relations, it'll be done respectfully, but the third leg of what we'll do is not only stick, you know, have our American relationship and have a more strategic view of our engagement in North Asia and Asia more generally, but I want Australia to be the best neighbour other countries can have. You think about the street you live in. The best thing you do for the safety of your house and your kids is have good neighbours watching out for you. So I intend to make as the first places I visit if I become Prime Minister. It won't be to Washington or Beijing, although they'll be very important, no question. Tokyo and the rest, all very important. But I'll be visiting New Zealand, I'll be visiting Papua New Guinea, I'll be visiting Indonesia and Timor, like good neighbours. You know, some countries think they say 100 years ahead, but in foreign policy I'm thinking a couple of generations. The Pacific. We need to view the Pacific not as somewhere you fly over going somewhere else, but as a blue continent. We need to see the opportunities of Australia being a reliable neighbour to its friends. And before someone says, oh, but you can't give foreign aid, you've got to spend it at home. Well, I'm not saying that. I'm saying, of course we prioritise our people, but good nations, smart nations, we're the 12th biggest country in the world. We're a unique nation. We're the only people who have a whole continent to ourselves. We're lucky. Although with their climate change policies, you know, they're wrecking that. But the point about it is that we shouldn't be afraid of the rest of the world. We should approach the rest of the world on our terms. We should be the best at what we want to be the best at. Not just tax loopholes. We should be the best at the education. We should be the best at our healthcare system. We should be the best at being a more egalitarian society where you get proper wage rises. We should be the best at looking after our pensioners, our carers, our people on the NDIS. I have an ambitious view of Australia's identity. That's why, for example, I think that we need to sit down and put our first Australians in the Constitution. The nation's birth certificate. I'll go to Pauline's and come back to the points, and that's where you were headed. Do you know, in Australia, you know, we watched the films of 1960s America. You know, they had the big civil rights and Mississippi burning, and you saw all of the fights they had that African Americans had for equal recognition. We say, well, that was then. And we look at 1967 and the referendum where we acknowledged Aboriginal Australians as Australians. But we've got a lot of challenges right now. That was history, but some of that history is still here now. Your skin should not be a predictor at the age of 18 if you're more likely to go to jail than go to university. But for young Aboriginal men, that's the case.
Yep.
We see too many people in our legal system caught up in custodial sentences, not for committing very serious crimes of assault or robbery or, you know, the serious stuff, but because they haven't paid fines. Yes. And there is no default system. We keep putting some of our youngest Australians in jail because we don't know what else to do. So yeah, we're going to work on with the states about closing the gap in justice, and that must mean greater resources for legal aid. But when people talk about First Australians, for me, it's a question of what sort of country we want to see in the mirror. See, some people say what makes a successful country is how many billionaires you have. I think what makes a successful country is how you're treating people who are disadvantaged. Patrick very generously said that Deb O'Neill beat Craig Kelly on a debate. As soon as she walked in the room, Craig Kelly was in trouble. But Patrick also talked about disability and the cut-off of 65. You know, when I was a very junior minister in the previous government, I was given the area of disabilities and I didn't know too much about it. I had seen people with disabilities through my time as a union rep, people get catastrophically injured at work or exposed to industrial diseases. But I had no idea of how Australia was treating us second class, systemically, sometimes consciously, more often than not unconsciously, treating people with disability and also their carers and loved ones as second class. It was like we'd built a big invisible wall around Australians who are carers and people with disability, and within those walls, just getting lesser outcomes on everything, which is not the country we should be. So we worked up the National Disability Insurance Scheme, thousands of advocates and families and people with disability. Now this current government, their heart's not in it. That doesn't mean individually there's not a lot of charitable and compassionate people. Sure, there can be in both sides of politics. But if you want to get the job done, then you've got to have in power the party who's most interested and committed to seeing equality. So with the NDIS, I was shocked. You could have not... I mean, this is a government who I would have thought couldn't surprise me. Mind you, they do some days. But in their budget, they're saying, oh, we have a surplus. Then when we looked at the fine print, we found that one of the ways they have a WEFA-fin surplus is that they managed to underspend money on disabled Australians and their carers. Now, what the current fellow did sort of say in Parliament, said it's a demand-driven program, so if we don't spend all the money we'd allocate it, of course we can use it for other things. And I thought, oh my Lord, how out of touch are these people? You know, there is demand, it's just not being met. What's happened under this government, the stewardship of the NDIS, there's a lot of good stories. But what's happened is they've basically made it hard to get the money out of the door to the people who deserve it by creating, in some cases, too much of a bureaucracy. There is a plague of consultants and contractors. Do you know they capped the number of permanent staff the National Disability Insurance Authority could have? So you pay 4 times as much to a consultant to write a report about how you double handle, triple handle things, and in the meantime, the real world is people are not getting the chairs they require. They're not getting the amendments to the homes and the houses. You know, they're not getting that home support. There should be a... But the ironic thing is that even despite all that government handling, I looked at the aged care assessment teams when we were designing the disability scheme and said we need to have more personalised care for people under 65. But because Labor's been able to relentlessly beat the drum with thousands of Australians, every Australian counts in disability, somehow we've leapfrogged aged care. Now, there are a lot to repair on the NDIS, and if the government thinks that I'm going to let them forget that they manufactured a deliberate underspend of $1.6 billion when people with disability need that now, no wonder that would make them pretty angry. But the other problem is that aged care's dropped back. This government's cut $1.9 billion out of aged care, and the government uses, you know, they've never seen a set of numbers they can't dodgy up. They're like riverboat gamblers. You've got to wash both hands, the hat, the legs, whatever they're doing. They're dodgy as dodgy can be. And the point about them is, yes, there are more older people. So yes, they're spending more money than they were. But when you look at you break it down and you look at if they'd kept the same rate of expenditure that Labor had, they've actually cut heading towards $2 billion out of aged care. You know, I said there should be a Royal Commission. Initially, the poor old aged care minister said I was guilty of elder abuse for scaring older people. Now the current fellas, you know, out there on national TV crying about what's happening, you know, on aged care and people with disability. For 2 years, we supported having a Royal Commission into abuse against people with disability. For 2 years, we were told we were wrong. And now, you know, they've done it, which is fine. Politics is not a maths problem. I don't mind how the current government gets to an answer. I don't care about their working out. It could be based on the calculus that they know the people are fed up with them and they've realised belatedly they can't just be a one-trick pony with business tax cuts for the top end of town. But in your case, Patrick, we need to follow up because there should be a continuity of care proposition within the NDIS, which means that once you pass 65, the level of care shouldn't drop away. So we'll follow up your individual matter. I think what you described in a modest way, it is ridiculous, and it's part of the more general problem in aged care. This is a governmental fight for you to have a tax subsidy if you're already comfortable. But on the waiting lists of aged care, it's now 130,000. And as you know, that if you can age in home, getting the necessary support, it's a much better proposition. And look at the way we treat the aged care workforce. You know, the aged care workers are unsung heroes, and we've got a lot more to say about them in coming weeks. We back our aged care workforce. We're asking 2 or 3 people a shift to pull off miracles. And you know, the aged care workforce in this country has not had proper pay rises, even though we're asking them to do a lot more. So, Patrick, we want to follow up your individual matter. The circumstances you described should not be occurring, but there's a bigger story here. I choose better aged care over bigger tax cuts for companies. I choose better National Disability Insurance Scheme funding over bigger tax loopholes. It's all about choices. The nation can afford to treat our older Australians when they have health needs and support needs better than we do. People with disabilities in their carers don't need to be attacked by ministers and say you're using your disability. What in fact we need in this country is to recognise every Australian deserves equal treatment, and that's what we're going to deliver. Thank you. There are 2 points I want to go to, and Michael, I've tried to answer a bit of your question about the home support and also on the disability, but I want to go to Trish's comments, and then it was Cecily? Just on Cecily, and I'll finish on Trish. Here's some economic numbers you'll never hear the government say. They've doubled the national debt, which means that we're paying $18 to $19 billion each year just to pay the interest on the debt they've raised. This myth of liberal or national economic supermen, little blokes, is a myth. Let me go to some numbers they don't tell you. 1, they've doubled the debt. 2, they love to talk about taxes, 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 taxes. The point about it is, did you know this government in this budget raised more overall dollars in taxes than any time in the history of the Commonwealth? It's about $470 billion in extra money. They've got that each year. It makes you wonder what they're doing with it, doesn't it? Household debt, here's another number. People are dipping into their household savings just to keep pace these days. Here's another number. Electricity prices, up and up and up. As I said, it's positively like a Stephen King novel opening an electricity bill these days. It's Fright Night. Here's another one, which the government never talk about, wage stagnation. You know, everything's going up in Australia except your wages. I mean, corporate profits since the last election where the Liberals offered us Malcolm Turnbull, gone up about 39% on average. Wages have gone up 5%.
Shame.
You know, incredible. Here's another number. Out-of-pocket costs to see the doctor. Because this government's frozen the patient rebate, the out-of-pocket costs to see a GP have gone up on average about 20% while I've been in, and the out-of-pocket costs to see a specialist closer to 40%. Now, these are challenges, these are priorities. So you're right, they pat themselves on the back, but they pretty much do that most days when they get up and tie their shoelaces. So, you know, and the point about it, little humour never hurt the meeting, did it? But the point about it is that they haven't managed the economy in the interest of working people. Penalty rates have been cut arbitrarily. It's not as if the shop assistants and hospitality work in Australia got a big lift in their hourly rate to compensate for the cutting of the public holiday and Sunday rates. We've got wage stagnation and wage cuts. This is not the way this nation should be. And yes, you're going to hear a lot of lies from them. You know, some research group must have said to them, just always accuse Labor of doing the wrong thing. Well, we're taking that little grenade and throwing it right back at them. They're lying on tax. You know, we want to wind back unsustainable tax concessions in the system. We want to wind back negative gearing subsidies, not for anyone who currently invests, but in the future. Because I need to find the money to properly pay for aged care, to properly pay for our schools, to properly pay for our health care. And it's a choice. It's a choice. And we're going to do that, and we're going to have the argument. But when I wind back an unsustainable tax subsidy, that is not a tax increase. What we're going to stop doing is giving some people the money, and we're going to use it for everyone. Multinationals, we're going to make them pay their fair share. There's another one. There's another one. Needless to say, you know, our very this got twisted, but did you know in Australia that if you deduct millions of dollars off your tax, if you're in such a fortunate position to do that, you can also deduct the cost of your accountant deducting your tax? Now, we're going to keep it up to $3,000, so most of you, if you're fortunate enough to pay an accountant $3,000, you can claim that back on your tax. But what I can't do is have a country where if you pay your accountant $1 million to deduct millions of dollars off the system, you get to claim that deduction as well. So the question is, who do you trust to manage the economy in the interests of working and middle class people? We have a wages policy, we have a climate policy, we've got a great health policy, we've got an education policy, we've got a childcare policy, we've got a policy to help restore the money they're taking from the NDIS. They're our policies. And who do you trust to get them right? I would put to you, my party is a lot closer to being trusted on that than this Trish, you made that remarkable intervention a bit earlier, and you honestly told us, you know, the anxiety and the battle you're in. Care's a great system. You know, when you travel, if you get the chance to travel overseas and you talk to, you know, your American friends, you know, a lot of them would say they like our healthcare system, you know, universal healthcare. But we can't take it for granted. We've always got to fight hard to save it. I mean, for many elections, the Libs were against it. They've more recently worked out that's electoral poison. But we now want to improve it. We want to improve it. And one of the big challenges, not the only challenge, we spoke about stroke earlier, that's a big challenge, a massive challenge. But one of the big challenges is the diagnosis of cancer. 1 in every 2 of us, and there's hundreds of people here, will get a diagnosis across our lifetime. And if you don't get the diagnosis, someone in your family has. You can think about the young mums. I think about my aunt who passed away from breast cancer when they perhaps didn't have the treatments they have now. I've got beautiful cousins who've got to get their little girls to be tested for the BRCA gene. It's real. We were talking about skin cancer at we're the skin cancer capital of the world. We shouldn't be. That's one we can prevent by slip, slop, slap. And by the way, we announced at the netball courts that we're going to do the first national campaign to encourage people to slip, slop, slap today. But cancer, people don't realise, is not all covered in the system. And that was Trish's contribution. Now, I'm not saying we're going to be able to cover every cost, but I think we can do a lot better at covering a lot more of the costs. Now, the current fellow said that, oh, we're doing a lot of the things. Well, just talk to some survivors. It's been a privilege in this last week to visit day oncology wards, to talk to people diagnosed with pancreatic cancer where there's less than 10% chance of surviving 5 years. It's been a privilege to meet remarkable warm people who are worried about how their families are coping even though they're getting their own treatment. Cancer makes you sick, but it shouldn't make you poor. I met this amazing woman on Monday, Elaine. You know, you tell she's a lovely personality, the sort of person you want as your neighbour. Just warm, you just tell. And she said, oh, this is, I got my diagnosis 8 years ago in 2011, tried a lot of the medicines. I've had to go between public and private. Our public system's great, but not all the drugs you get or require for your treatment are available. And we have waiting lists in our public system. So it's a hybrid system, that's what it is. But she said, I'm going to try this new drug, but it's less than 10% chance. But what she said is, I accept that. She said to me, I just worry about how much debt my family will be in after I've gone. So we've helped her access her superannuation. But how did we get to a system in Australia where superannuation, which is for your retirement, you have to use to cover the cancer fight? And Trish said it, her own work experience. When you're fighting the cancer, and depending on what stage it's at, you can't hold down a full-time job. So cancer makes you sick, but it shouldn't make you poor, and it's going to be one of the issues of this election. And I may be guilty of optimism, I may be guilty of a bit of passion, I may be guilty of a bit of idealism, but this is what I think. You know, the fact that we're going to supply 6 million Medicare-free scans over the next 4 years, 3 million extra visits we've budgeted to specialists, that we're going to fund cancer research, that we're going to work on building $500 million worth of new resources into the public system so they can get their waiting list down. We've got $300 million to build new physical infrastructure and ensure that there's cancer treatment in the regions. We want, I have an ambition for this country, that we are the best country in the world at fighting cancer, that we stand alongside each other. And my optimism is that my dream of being able to stand alongside every Australian in the fight against cancer trumps the negative crap that comes out of this government on everything else.
Thank you, everybody.